When I was at college, we were instructed to purchase this book, Introduction to the Old Testament. I believe it's a fairly standard work of introducing the Old Testament to students. It covers all sorts of topics in the Old Testament, including the Apocrypha. And when it came to the book of Exodus, it dealt with the problem of the date of the Exodus, and it acknowledged that there were two different views. The one, which is based upon the data in the Bible, would point to a date of 1445 for the Exodus, whereas a more modern view, one that's held perhaps by a majority of scholars, puts the Exodus not in 1445, but in the middle of the 13th century, or round about 1280 BC. And the reason for that is very simple. My name's Ken Down, and I'm the son of David Down, whom many of you will know as a biblical archaeologist. Now, it's all down to this chappie, Ramses II, seen here 4 times over on the facade of his temple at Aswan. You see, in the book of Exodus, we're told that the Jews, the Israelites, were forced to build store cities, and they are named as Pithom and Ramses. And not unnaturally, some have suggested that these cities were named after the ruling pharaoh. And therefore, you see, the ruler at the time must have been Ramses. It's a bit of a silly argument, really, because 215 years earlier, the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, were settled in the district of Ramses, which also was presumably named after a pharaoh. Now, Ramses II was the longest-lived pharaoh in Egyptian history. He died at around about 98, I think it is, after having 55 sons and a comparable number of daughters, but not 215 years. So what is going on? Well, the answer is very simple. Some later scribe inserted the, quotes, modern name for those places, which was Ramses. You find the same sort of thing in, for example, the book of Joshua, where Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba. Okay, so you're given both the old name and the modern name. There are very good reasons for thinking that Ramses could not be the pharaoh of the Exodus. For example, Ramses was powerful. He was one of the strongest pharaohs in Egyptian history. There is no way that the Israelites could have successfully escaped from him, because his rule extended right up into Syria. The records of his reign are pretty well complete. I won't say you can give a minute-by-minute account or even a day-by-day account, but you can certainly give a month-by-month account of his reign. And there's just no room for an exodus or for plagues or anything like that. And of course, there is the fact that Ramses' capital was down at Thebes, Luxor, whereas the children of Israel and Moses, presumably, were up in the land of Goshen, which is up by the delta. Now, that's 400, 500 miles away. So if Moses wanted to travel back and forth between the two, that was an 800,000-mile round trip. If Pharaoh wanted to send, as we know he did, people to find out what was happening to the Jews, whether they were exempt from the plagues or not, again, that was a 1,000-mile round trip. How long would it take to do that? You know, it's just not feasible for Ramses to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Plus, at this time, the middle of the 13th century, 1280 BC, Jericho was in ruins and had been in ruins for several centuries. So it wasn't there for Joshua to knock down. And according to the record that we have, there was no invasion of Palestine. There was no change of culture. The most you can say is that there may have been a few immigrants come in from across the Jordan, infiltrate in and get assimilated by the dominant culture of Palestine. So there's just no way that Ramses can be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, I want you to note what has happened, because the Exodus, according to the Bible, should be in 1445 BC. But people have felt free to move it forward and put it in the time of Ramses II. Well, if it's legitimate to move it forward in order to try and make it fit in with the circumstances, in this case the name Ramses, surely it must be legitimate to move it backwards as well from the Bible date. And I would like to suggest that we should in fact move the Exodus back to the end of early Bronze and the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. And in particular, I'd like to tell you about this chap, Sesostris I. Now, the poor fellow, he came to the throne after his father was assassinated by his bodyguard, in fact. And you could well imagine that after something like that happening, Sesostris might be just a trifle paranoid. And the Bible record shows that the Pharaoh at this time was indeed paranoid. Somehow he came to be suspicious of his baker and his cupbearer, two people who were in an excellent position to poison him, and he put them in prison, where there happened to be a young man by the name of Joseph. Well, you know the rest of the story. So the story certainly fits in with the circumstances that we find. Also from this same period, the reign of Sesostris I, we have the tomb of Ameni, one of the governors of the nome, the Oryx nome, in fact. And he boasts in an inscription in his tomb, "There was none hungry in my time. When years of famine came, I kept the people from starving." Okay? So he boasts about his success during the time of famine. And it must have been more than a normal one-year famine for him to think that it was worthwhile mentioning. In fact, another document from the same period is a letter from a young chap called Heckernacht to his mother. It's nice to know that boys were writing to their mothers even back then. And he writes to tell her, as all boys do, they don't want their mums to worry, "Do not be anxious about me, for I am healthy and alive." And then he gives a reason why his mother might be worried about him, although the whole land is dead from hunger, and it's so bad they have begun eating people here. In other words, the famine has been so bad, so severe, that there are cases of cannibalism. So certainly Sesostris I would fit as the pharaoh for Joseph. Now there is one discordant note, and that is that Sesostris III was responsible for a remarkable change in the way in which Egypt was organized. He vastly decreased the power of the nomarchs, the governors of the provinces, and also the nobles, and he seems to have taken sort of personal possession of the land and turned the people into mere serfs. Now, the interesting thing is that that is recorded as what Joseph did, because Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and no doubt Joseph felt quietly pleased that he had served his new master so well. By reducing the people to servitude, it came back to bite him, of course, because when the time came for some Pharaoh who wanted to enslave the children of Israel, the Egyptians were all for it because they had bitter memories of the one who had reduced them to servitude. He didn't buy the land of the priests because they got a fixed allowance from Pharaoh. During this same 12th dynasty, but a little bit later on, we have the record that there were many Semitic slaves in Egypt. For example, we find them left in people's wills or mentioned on tomb inscriptions. Gardner, in his book Egypt of the Pharaohs, says, "In this connection it should be noted that on stele and in papyri, Asiatic slaves are increasingly often mentioned, though there's no means of telling whether they were prisoners of war or had infiltrated into Egypt of their own accord." Well, of course, if I'm correct, and these are the Israelites, they did come in of their own accord because they were wanting to follow Jacob and escape from the famine in Palestine. And then, of course, they were reduced to slavery. During this time of slavery, many of them were employed in building works. and some of them are employed in building pyramids, which is interesting because Josephus in his Antiquities says, having forgotten the benefits they, that is the Egyptians, had received from Joseph, particularly the crown being now come into another family, the Egyptians became very abusive to the Israelites and contrived many ways of afflicting them. They enjoined them to cut a great number of channels for the river, in other words, to build canals, and to build walls for their cities and ramparts so that they might restrain the river. They set them also to build pyramids. Now, this statement of Josephus has occasioned a certain amount of mirth among scholars because they think of the pyramids at Giza and they say, these were hundreds of years before any possible date for Joseph and the children of Israel. And, of course, they're all built of stone, whereas the Bible record tells us that the Israelites were employed in making bricks. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar. And again, when Moses turned up and started making things difficult, Pharaoh retaliated by depriving the slaves of straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, he said. Well, the interesting thing is that at this same time, this 12th dynasty, you find pyramids made of mud brick. And it goes without saying, the mud brick is made of mud mixed with straw. So it would seem that Josephus was right all along, provided we put the Exodus back in the 12th dynasty when these pyramids were being made. Now, approximately a century after the Pyramid of Kahun was built, during that time, slaves had been retained to minister to the rituals and ceremonies appropriate for a dead pharaoh, to keep the cult going, to support the priests, and so on. And as I say, about a century after the pyramid was built, suddenly these slaves all upped sticks and disappeared, leaving their tools behind them. This is what Rosalie David, in her pretty standard book, The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, has to say. It is apparent that the completion of the king's pyramid was not the reason why Kahun's inhabitants eventually deserted the town, abandoning their tools and other possessions in the shops and houses. You see, if workmen were moving on to a different job, they would take their tools with them. But you could well imagine that slaves would be only too glad to leave the instruments of their oppression behind and get away from them. But what is interesting is that when Sir Flinders Petrie excavated the village of Kahun, where these slaves lived, he found that as well as the tools that had been left behind, the women had left behind their jewelry. Now, admittedly, the jewelry was only what you'd expect slaves to wear, the stone beads or faience beads. It wasn't terribly valuable, but it's quite attractive, Why would the women leave their jewelry behind? Well, the Bible gives us an answer, because every woman is to ask her neighbor when Pharaoh finally gives the command to leave, and every woman living in a house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing which you put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Why would you wear stone beads and faience beads if you can be wearing gold and silver and precious stones? There is another thing that is interesting about this time of the Exodus. Can you see that little yellow circle over on the left-hand side, the western edge of the Sinai Peninsula? That is the ancient turquoise mine of Sarabat el-Khadim. A number of expeditions went there over the centuries, and in fact there were expeditions there during the 12th century, during the 12th dynasty, and every expedition that went there in this howling wilderness added to the temple and added a couple of stelae, invoking the protection of the goddess Hathor, who was believed to be the patron goddess of mines and turquoise and so on. And as well as the hieroglyphic inscriptions that were here, there are also inscriptions in a very limited set of characters. Now, hieroglyphics have got hundreds of different symbols or characters, but here you only have about 20, whatever it may be, and that is typical of an alphabet. And so it would seem that someone, now obviously not the Egyptian scribes, they were using hieroglyphs, Probably these are the Semitic slaves who are doing all the hard work, and they wanted to carve the equivalent of Kilroy Wazir on the stones where they were working, and so they devised this alphabetic script. Now you can see in that upper picture you have a symbol covered in red. That is a bull, and it stands for the symbol Aleph. In a later inscription, you have the same symbol. You can see it up here on top right, and it has been very much simplified, but I particularly want you to notice how, if you simplified it just a little bit further, like this, it is the modern Hebrew Aleph, or bull. And down here, you have another symbol. If you were to cut off that tail, which is supposed to represent a kneeling man with his hands upraised in worship or something, and turned it on its side, you would have a very creditable E. The symbols, although based upon Egyptian hieroglyphs, were based in a rather interesting way. For example, this symbol is used in hieroglyphs for pair or house, and you get great house, pair O, all right? But the Semitic slaves, they said, that's a symbol for a house, yes. But of course, house in our language is bait. And so this symbol, turned on its side, has become Beth, Alpha Beth, you see, Bethel, house. So these symbols appear to be based in a way upon hieroglyphs, but upon the Semitic language for the words that are represented by the hieroglyphs. Now, what's this got to do with the Exodus? Well, just at this time, Moses was somewhere over there tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Midian is over on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. It's in Saudi Arabia. What was Moses doing all the way over in the Sinai? What was he doing over in the Mount Horeb? He led his flock there. It's not the sort of lush grazing land that you would lead your flock to, unless there's some very good reason. Well, I suggest that the reason was that he was aware of this mining operation, and that the workmen, the slaves, needed food, and so he had taken his flock there to sell it to the Egyptians. And while he was there, of course, having been brought up in Egypt, he could read hieroglyphs probably, and he saw the hieroglyphic inscriptions, yes, but then he also saw these other ones. And because he could speak the language of these Semitic slaves, he talked to them, discovered what it was all about. And just at the time when God wanted Moses to start writing books about the traditions and history of the Israelites, he presents him with a convenient and simple way of writing so that he can carry out God's wishes. And the result is the books of Job, of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Well, Moses went back to Egypt and started performing miracles before Pharaoh and bringing down plagues on Pharaoh. And from this end of the 12th, or possibly even end of the 13th dynasty, we have a very interesting document known as the Ipuwer Papyrus. It's in the Leiden Museum in Holland. Now, we're not certain from when it dates, because there's no date in it. Judging upon the style of the writing and the style of the grammar, it's been placed either at the end of the Middle Kingdom or at the end of the Early Kingdom. I think it was probably from the Middle Kingdom, because look at some of the things it's got to say. Nay, but corn has perished everywhere. People are stripped of clothing, perfume, oil. Remember the Jewish women going around and begging for the best clothing and getting it as well? Everyone says there is no more, the storeroom is bare. It has come to this, the king has been taken away, a euphemism for being killed, by poor men. And then comes the really shocking bit. Nay, but the river is turned to blood. Can a man drink from it? He turns from it with loathing, which is exactly what we are told in the book of Exodus, that when Moses raised his staff and struck the water of the Nile, the Egyptians could not drink its water. It was so foul. It was blood. It smelled bad. Well, as a result of these plagues, Egypt was drastically damaged. And then, with all these slaves departing, the economy took a fearful hit. And the whole situation was only made worse when the Egyptian army was drowned in the Red Sea. And the result was that Egypt was wide open for the taking, and there were people not far off waiting for the opportunity, the Hyksos. And Josephus, quoting the Egyptian author Manetho, described that there was a king of ours whose name was Timaeus. Unto him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us. And they came after a surprising manner, men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, and had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with ease subdued it. Why? Because Egypt was reeling from the effects of the plague, and it was defenseless because its army and its king were both gone. Interestingly, when Israel defeated the Egyptians in 1967 in the Six-Day War, this man, Dr. Rudolf Kahun, who in later life became one of the heads of the Israeli Antiquities Department, he was a young archaeologist, and during the 10 or 12 years that the Israelis controlled the Sinai, he undertook repeated surveys of the Sinai, looking for archaeological evidence. And he found traces of a very distinctive style of pottery, which he dated to the beginning of the early Bronze, scattered all across Sinai and up into Palestine. And this is a plot of the various sites that he found. He found a particular concentration of these potsherds around about here at Kadesh Barnea, but you'll notice how they take a wide circle around the land of Edom. Isn't that what the Israelites did? He believes that these particular potsherds, or this particular style of pottery, is the invading Israelites coming into the land of Palestine, circling around Edom, and then entering into Palestine and taking over the whole land. Which brings me neatly to the question, what about Jericho? Well, at the end of the early Bronze, Jericho was a rich and powerful city, no question of it being uninhabited. And then suddenly it was destroyed. When Professor John Garstang, was excavating there, he made a discovery of walls that had apparently toppled down in an earthquake. They'd fallen down the outside of the slope. Now here you can see part of one of those walls. You can see how it's fallen down the slope. And he dated this to the beginning of the Iron Age, and therefore said that this was the Israelites, and this was Joshua destroying Jericho. That's why his book is called When the Walls Fell Down. Now, a decade or two later, Kathleen Kenyon came along with more advanced techniques, and she was able to demonstrate that these fallen walls, in fact, dated from the end of the early Bronze. And of course, then everyone said, well, that's it can't be the Israelites. There was no Joshua, there was no Exodus, the walls didn't fall down, it's all a myth. But of course, if you place the Exodus at the end of the early Bronze, then here you are, here's the evidence. Furthermore, Kenyon found that outside these walls, there's a great pile of ash up to 3 feet thick. You can see it here, pinkish-colored ash, piled up outside the walls. And it's interesting that the Bible tells us that the Israelites burned the whole city and everything in it, apart from the silver and gold and the imperishable items which they put in the treasury of Yahweh's house. So it would certainly seem that there is evidence for the destruction of Jericho. But what is even more interesting is what came next, because I have here a book written by Margaret Wheeler, who was the wife, I think, of the famous archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler, and the book is called The Walls of Jericho. And in it she describes how she spent a couple of years working with Dr. Kathleen Kenyon at the excavations of Jericho. And what is interesting is what she says about the period that followed the early Bronze Age. This is her chapter heading, The Wandering Tribes. Can you see that? So in other words, the people who came into Jericho after the early Bronze were not another civilization, they were wandering nomads. And she says that the early Bronze Age folk were defeated and faded into oblivion. The newcomers were a semi-nomadic people who were invading Palestine and destroying the established towns. The archaeological evidence consistently reveals a period of destruction. Many of the great walled citadels of Palestine cease to exist as prosperous towns, and the land is given over to nomadic and semi-nomadic tribesmen. Isn't that just the Bible picture? That you have these Israelites coming in who had a nomadic background. They were sheep herders, animal herders, and they had just come from 40 years of wandering in the desert. So it's hardly surprising that they were nomadic. Here is Kathleen Kenyon's own book, Digging Up Jericho, in which she tells the story of her excavations there, and her chapter that follows the early Bronze Age also, Nomadic Invaders. And she too has a lot to say about what a complete break this was with the early culture. As our detailed knowledge of Palestinian archaeology has gradually increased over the past 30 years or so, it has become apparent that there was a very sharp break between the early Bronze Age of the third millennium and the Middle Bronze of the first half of the second. Common everyday pots are the most sensitive barometer of a drastic change in population. There is virtually no continuity in pottery between the two periods, and it is perhaps excessive caution to use the qualifying virtually. So the people who came in and took the place of the Canaanites were a completely new culture, a new civilization, if you like, but it was a nomadic civilization. And there was no permanent settlement on the Tell, no permanent settlement in the area. What Margaret Wheeler found was that there were different types of tombs. These people had different burial customs from the Canaanites who'd gone before them, and not only was that, but she found at least 3 different types of Middle Bronze Age tombs, which she interpreted as 3 different tribes who were occupying this area, coming and visiting the fountain, the water supply, the spring at Jericho, and occasionally burying their dead there. And so this would again appear to be in harmony with what the Bible tells us, that Jericho was deserted, there were nomadic people there, and those nomadic people were divided into at least 3 tribes. But there's one other interesting point that comes out from Kathleen Kenyon's book, and that is that during the tombs of the preceding period were filled with silt, deep layer of silt, up to 2.5 feet of silt. Now, she attributes this to deforestation by the early Bronze people. They needed wood for fuel, for building, and so on. But I believe that this deforestation, in fact, came after the early Bronze, because we have in the book of Joshua, where Joshua says to the tribe of Ephraim, if you're so numerous, and if the hill country of Ephraim is too small for you, go up into the forest and clear land for yourselves there. So in other words, they're being instructed to cut down the trees. Again, a couple of verses later on, Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are numerous and very powerful. You will not only have one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it, and its furthest limits will be yours. So the evidence does seem to fit the requirements of the Bible story. There was a new culture, a nomadic culture. Jericho was conquered and deserted. Many of the cities of Palestine were conquered, but also deserted because the people kept to a nomadic lifestyle. And where they could, they cleared the forests because they couldn't manage to drive out the Canaanites completely, and they needed living room within the area that had been allotted to them. Now, there is one problem, and that is that this schema that I'm putting forward is not without its difficulties. And one of the main difficulties is that we can only give approximate dates. The very earliest fixed dates are the Limu lists from Assyria, but they only began around 892 BC. Before that, Before 892, it's all just, well, I won't say guesswork. It's based upon carbon-14 dating and reading of chronological statements by the Egyptians and adding together the reigns of kings and so on. But it's not the same as the astronomically fixed dates that we get from the Limu lists. However, going by this, going by data in the Bible, we can place Solomon's temple around about 975 BC. And if the Exodus took place 480 years earlier, which is what the Bible says in a statement in 1 Kings chapter 6, then the Exodus must have happened around 1445 BC. Okay. Then we know that Abraham lived about 430 years earlier, though the time spent in Egypt was probably only about 215 years, and so the time of Abraham is also fixed. However, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, modern scholars don't like this, and so they move the Exodus, completely ignoring what's said in the Bible, they move the Exodus forward to 1280 BC because of the name of Ramses. That, of course, means that we have to move Abraham forward as well. But it doesn't fit. There is virtually nothing except the name Ramses that fits the biblical account. So I suggest that we ought, in fact, to move these events backwards in time. And we move the Exodus back to the beginning of Middle Bronze, or as some people call it, Intermediate Bronze. And that means, of course, we have to move Abraham back as well. We can locate Joseph then. But there is a problem, and that is that you can see from that lower line that that places the Exodus towards the beginning of the Middle Kingdom instead of at the end of the Middle Kingdom, which is what I believe. So how can we solve this? Well, one solution would be that if we take the biblical date for the Exodus, that's much closer to the end of Middle Bronze. But if instead of using that 480 years, we actually add up the lengths of the judges, we find that we can push the Exodus back by another century or even more, because we don't know how long Samuel reigned, how long he judged for. So we can push the Exodus back to 1593 or even a couple of decades earlier. That still leaves us with a gap between the Middle Bronze Exodus and the Exodus we calculate from the biblical data. So some have suggested that we need to move the Egyptian history forward. Now, that's not biblical scholars who have said that. That's a man called P.D. James, who has found reason to believe that Egypt's history is too long by 2 or 2.5 centuries. Mind you, that still leaves us 3 centuries gap. But can we move Egypt's history even further forward? I believe that we can. And you might say, well, now, come on, just a moment. You're playing fast and loose with history. You're wanting to knock 500 years out of Egypt's history. That's impossible. There's a detailed scheme being worked out by the historians, and you can't just go mucking about with it like that. Can't we? Well, this is a newspaper report from 2013. Notice, 500 years knocked out of Egypt's history, just like that. Egypt's history is, I'm afraid, somewhat fluid, and you can adjust it. So I believe that the solution is that Egypt's history needs to be moved forward, the Exodus needs to be moved back a little bit, and you will find that it then slots neatly into the right place where the story of the Exodus fits the story told to us by history. Of course, I don't claim to have all the answers. I know that I don't. But I do think that I have many of the answers.